In looking at the subject of Hellenism in the New Testament, we are studying a little about the Greek words for Greek in the New Testament. We come to our sixth one and our last one tonight. Having gone through a list of 5 of them already, we come to our sixth and final one, which is the one we want to spend time with. Hellenistai. 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 It's a rare word that is not found in literature anywhere earlier than the book of Acts. And so it's just assumed that it's evidently new here. And it's also assumed that perhaps the term is coined by the writer Luke. It's not found anywhere earlier in literature than the book of Acts. Now, the fifth word that we looked at last time was Hellene, which I said was the basic, H-E-L-L-E-N, Hellene, which is the basic normal Greek word for Greek in the New Testament. This is a normal word, and therefore most of the other words are a derivative of this fifth word. The last one we studied last time, we had a lot of scriptures, 3 different categories that we put under Hellene. However, this rare term, Hellenistai, does not owe its origin to the noun Hellene, the normal Greek term for Greek, but rather to the verb Hellenizo. Now that is H-E-L-L-E-N-I-Z-O, Hellenizo. By adding an agent suffix of tes, T-E-S, with this verb, Hellenizo, we end up with the noun Hellenistai, which basically could just be translated as Hellenist or Hellenists, if you have it in the plural. Agent suffix, of course, speaking of the doer of the action. Now, all lexicons and grammars agree on this point, its origin, that this rare term, and by the way, this is a term you see that we're going to be studying that's found 3 times in Acts 6, 9, and 11. Not found anywhere else in Scripture, not found any earlier than this, the book of Acts, although it is found later. It does not owe its origin to the normal Greek word for Greek, Helen. Rather, it owes its origin to the verb, Hellenizo, with an agent suffix, tes, T-E-S, which speaks of the doer of the action. So that the word, evidently, this term right here, Hellenistai, basically means this, a little short definition: one who practices or causes others to practice. Now, the causative element is not always there, and it doesn't appear to be here in Acts 6:1. One who practices or causes others to practice the Greek way of life. A Hellenist, in other words. One who practices or causes others, and my note on that second phrase was that the causative element that causes others to practice, the causative element is not always there. One who practices or causes others to practice the Greek way of life. So in a narrow sense, if we do nothing but study the etymology, just a big fancy word that means the linguistic origin, the etymology of the term, it has nothing to do with linguistics then. It has nothing to do, in other words, with the Greek language, that these people spoke the Greek language, but rather one who practices or causes others to practice the Greek way of life. But you can get into trouble by barking up the wrong tree, and sometimes etymology is the wrong tree, because all you end up with there is what we might call a purely semantic conclusion that's not always reliable. Actual history, which is not now known to us, may have molded this bare term, Hellenistai, and its meaning quite differently than what we would uncover or discover by a search of its etymological root. Now, the people of Acts, or the people who use the term like the writer Luke, they surely knew what the word meant. in their day, but that has now been lost. When the word appears again in the patristic era, that means 2nd, 3rd century A.D., when Hellenistai appears again in the patristic era, here's what it means. See, it's changed meanings by then. P-A-G-A-N. It means pagan. You can tell that from the context of the patristic writers. So much for, etymology, so much for basing it on etymology, or basing it, that is, only on that, or basing it, and you surely wouldn't want to base it only on what the patristic writers have to say, because you end up with the term pagan. So what do we have here in Acts 6:1? But that the church is split up between the Hebrews, must be the true believers, and the Grecians, unsaved people, the pagans. Well, that hardly fits the context here. Luke is talking about the church at Jerusalem, two different groups in the church, and one of those certainly couldn't be a group of pagans. Maybe some people would opt for that, but that's not possible here. In any event, if you'll open your Bibles, if you haven't already, to Acts 6:1. There does appear to be a very obvious distinction, and here's maybe the first really important thing I've said tonight. You say, well, why'd you say the rest of that? Well, don't worry about it. First really important thing, there does appear to be an obvious distinction intended between simply, let's just say it like this, between this term, between simply Hellene and Hellenist. There appears to be a very obvious intended distinction to be read into these passages between our understanding, although Hellene, this term isn't found here in Acts 6:1, it's found many other places in the book of Acts, between Hellene, which would mean a Greek by birth, or a non-Greek Gentile who has been influenced by Greek ways, and Hellenistai, or Hellenist, something to do with Jewish people and the influence of Hellenism. Perhaps that's why Luke had to coin this term. All right, let me see. That maybe was a little confusing to you. Let me say it in a different way here then. We've got people that we could call in the first place Greeks. By that we mean people, someone who was born in Corinth. And his mother was born in Corinth, and his father was born in Athens. So we know this is truly a Greek here. All right. Then we've got non-Greek, that is by nationality. They're born in Babylon. Non-Greek Gentiles influenced by, the spirit of Hellenism, which is the Greek way of life. Now, this term Hellene, H-E-L-L-E-N, can be used for both of these two groups, as we saw last week with our fifth term. All right, then, what can you say? How can you describe, if you want to talk about Jewish people, who obviously can't be Greeks, and they obviously can't be Gentiles, but they're Jewish people influenced by Hellenism? I guess you could use the same term, but now you got one term that can mean one of three different things. And evidently what Luke does is he coins a new term, Hellenistai, to now speak of this thing right here at the end of the second one, marked out with Jews put in. Jews influenced by the spirit of Hellenism. Now that appears to be what we have here, a distinction intended between a Greek by birth or a non-Greek Gentile who has been influenced by Greek ways, and a Jewish person who has been influenced by the spirit of Hellenism. Okay, now here are the verses we're going to look at. I told you last week that I have enough material in my notes. I've got 5 weeks of notes. That's the way I have it all broken up. I hope we don't have to take that long. If I can do it in 2 or 3, then, the sooner the better as far as I'm concerned, because we can still learn the material, know the material, but be through with it earlier. But here are the verses we're going to look at. Acts 6:1. In those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Then chapter 9, verse 29, and Saul spake boldly in the name of the Lord Jesus, this is up in Damascus, and disputed against the Grecians, and they went about to slay him. Same term, Hellenistai, Grecians. The translation is the same too. It seems like we've gone to some type of different meaning now, though. We know what we're talking about over there in chapter 6. We're talking about believers, part of the early church. Whoever these people are, they're going about trying to kill someone who's just become a believer. The man Saul. That means they're hardly believers themselves. Although you could still have this as a meaning, though, this third thing, Jewish people influenced by the spirit of Hellenism, simply not saved. You could still have the same, origin for the term. And then chapter 11 and verse 20. Some of them were men of Cyprus and Cyrene, which, when they were come to Antioch, spake unto the Grecians, preaching the Lord Jesus. So again, similar to Acts 9:29, an unsaved group of people, because the Lord Jesus was being preached to them. Now the last one of these, chapter 11 and verse 20, has textual problems, which we will address later on. The middle one, Acts 9:29, is fairly easy to understand if we can properly deal with chapter 6 and verse 1. So that's where the buck stops, is Acts 6:1. We have to understand what we mean, or what Luke means by the term there, and then we can deal with 9:29 and 11:20. Now here's what one recent commentator had to say about the extreme significance of Acts 6:1, and I quote, "Historically, this verse is not only one of the most important in Acts, you might not have known that, but it is. It is also one of the most complicated and most discussed verses in the entire book. What one concludes regarding the identity of the Hellenistai, or the Hellenists, their relation to the Hebraists, the Hebrews, and their circumstances within the church largely affects how one understands the material in Luke's second panel, which runs from chapter 6 and verse 8 through chapter 9 and verse 31, and the whole course of events within the Jerusalem church as well." So he makes 3 points here to understand who these people are, the Grecians, secondly, who the Hebrews are, and then thirdly, what is the relation of these Grecians to the whole church process that Luke is discussing for us in the 6th chapter, from chapter 6 and verse 8 through 9:31, his so-called second panel, or the second section. Since 6:1 is kind of like an introduction, or 6:1 to 7 is an introduction to the panel that he's going to discuss from 6:8 to 9:31. So to miss whatever clue is being given to us in 6:1 would be to miss, and I really mean this, and this is what I'll show you later, and this is what will make the study worthwhile, is to miss why we have that long 7th chapter of 60 verses, just over and over and over, Stephen repeating what we could turn to the Old Testament ourselves and easily read, Old Testament history. And then why chapter 8 the way it is, and why the man Saul is kind of introduced at the end of chapter 8, the beginning of chapter, or the end of 7, the beginning of 8, and then again skipped over the rest of 8, the beginning of 9, as well as the first 31 verses of that chapter, which of course deal with his conversion. So the way to look at this situation, the identification of the Hellenistai, is to look at the various views which have been proposed. They are legion. I have maybe, how many do I have? I don't know, 7, 8, 9, something like that. Some of these can kind of be grouped together. So let's start looking at the views of how we're going to understand what Luke means by Hellenistai. So these are the options that have been proposed by various scholars in the process of the identification of, let's stay with the King James word, it's the appropriate word, Grecians of Acts 6:1, as well as the other verses. Okay, view number 1, we'll call the traditional view. The traditional view, this is the earliest recorded interpretation that we have. Now, we know that Luke knew what he meant, and others that read Acts knew what he meant. But then when you move several centuries beyond that, then we've lost an understanding of just what he meant by that and what the term means. So this is the earliest interpretation of the verse. As we'll see here in a moment, an offshoot of it has become the traditional one today, backed by most scholars and commentaries. But traditional in the sense that it's the earliest one. but it's very questionable, I feel. It goes back to the writings of Chrysostom. Chrystom. Now let me give you a couple of references here. Chrysostom, well, in his homilies on Acts 6:1 and homilies on Acts 9:29, those can be found in Post-Nicene Fathers, first series, volume 11, pages 89 and 135. Really all you need to know is that it goes back to Chrysostom. Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, first series, volume 11, pages 89 and 135. And here's what Chrysostom said. His argument was that the distinction, he recognizes some distinction. I mean, when it says that there was a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, you got two groups here. Someone is being distinguished from someone else. So what's going on here? Well, he said the distinction between the two groups was simply and only one of language. Was simply and only one of language. Now that appears obviously enough in a surface reading of the passage. Because look at the two terms that have been selected as translation, Grecians and Hebrews. Well, that would mean one group spoke Greek and the other group spoke Hebrew. Or we could say a Semitic tongue, such as Aramaic. And that was his argument. The distinction is simply and only one of language. One group, the Grecians, spoke Greek. The second group spoke a Semitic tongue. There is some argument of whether the early people really spoke Hebrew or rather Aramaic, but most scholars today believe they spoke Aramaic and not Hebrew, a Semitic tongue. And you could still call them Hebrew because they're cognate languages. Now this might also be supported by the Peshitta, which is the Syriac, the old Syriac translation. The Peshitta on Acts 9:29, which has this in Acts 9:29 as the translation rather than Grecians. It has Jews who understood Greek. Jews who understood Greek. See, that shows us that they are Jews, they're not Gentiles, but the distinction is one of language. These Jews understood Greek. Also, the lexicons and the Greek grammars follow Chrysostom's lead. I might mention a few, such as Thayer's and Souters, S-O-U-T-E-R. And you know the Old Testament, BDB, but the New Testament's always abbreviated BAG, bags, for Bauer, Art, and Gingrich. So it's best just to call them bag. There are a couple of lexicons, Thayer's, T-H-A-Y-E-R, Souters, and bags, and Greek grammars as well. Follow the lead of Chrysostom that this is the distinction, one of language and language only. Well, that's not true, and it's not true for the following reasons. So these are objections then to this first and traditional view. And you want to get these down because there'll be objections to a later view as well. We're objecting to the fact, if you haven't followed carefully enough along yet, we're objecting to the fact that the basic and the only distinction between these two groups is one of language. The Grecians spoke Greek. The Hebrews spoke a Semitic tongue. Hebrew, perhaps, Aramaic, more likely. Here are the objections. Number one, if the two groups each spoke one and only one different language, then how could they possibly have understood each other? How could anybody be murmuring about anything to anyone about anyone if you both spoke in foreign tongues? Now, it's sometimes assumed that Chrysostom and others would go a step further. I mean, they would say, well, at least one of the groups understood another language in addition to the natural one they spoke, so that the two groups could converse. But let's just keep it in its bare minimum right here. If this is the only distinction, one of language, then if the two groups each spoke one and only one Greek, one Aramaic, they couldn't possibly understand each other. The church would never have even gotten off the ground. A second objection would be stated in this question. Would a mere language difference have sparked such a controversy that it took the apostles to settle it? See, they may be starting on the wrong foot by looking for a language origin to the problem. If that was the only difference, one of language, could that have sparked such a controversy that it took the apostles to settle it? It's not Luke implying something more than that. A third objection, Paul calls himself an Hebrew in 2 Corinthians 11:22. He calls himself an Hebrew of Hebrews in Philippians 3:5. What's the conclusion? Well, an obvious one. The term that Paul uses in both of those passages, Hebrew, to speak of himself as a Hebrew, is the same term that appears here in Acts 6:1 as Hebrew. And yet we know Paul was a diaspora-born, Greek-speaking Jew. And yet he calls himself a Hebrew. You see, what they're doing here, what Chrysostom has done with these Grecians is he's made them Greek speakers. They're Jews, but they're Greek speakers. Maybe something else is implied by that. We'll get to what that maybe implication is here in a moment. But, I mean, you would have to put Paul over here then. Paul is a Greek-speaking Jew. I mean, of all things, not born in Palestine. Born outside of Palestine up in the diaspora. And this group of people would be those people who spoke Hebrew and or Aramaic who we would probably assume were probably born in Palestine or had some, intimate connection to Palestine. And yet here Paul could be appropriately called a Grecian, if the only distinction here is one of language because he did speak Greek, and yet he keeps calling himself a Hebrew or a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm not saying that he's not also a Grecian. I'm saying that Luke has set these over against each other to prove something very important here. And then a fourth objection, and I think the most important objection to this traditional view of language. Why the contrast between Hellenists and Hebrews? They say that it's because of the language difference, Greek and Aramaic. But Hebrew, that term Hebrew, is never used in this sense of language, but in an ethnic sense. You see, today we use the term Hebrew to speak of the Hebrew language. It was never used then to speak of the Hebrew language. When you're identifying a group of people by that and call them Hebrews because they're Hebrew speakers. Hebrew is always used in an ethnic sense. So if the distinction is basically or only one of language, then the contrast would be between Greek-speaking Jews and Aramaic-speaking Jews. But Luke gives us the ethnic Hebrew. In other words, he had other terms he could have used here rather than Hebrew. He's giving us an ethnic term, not really a linguistic term. And we've seen that to also be true with Hellenistai. It's not really based on the basis of language because it doesn't come from Hellene but Hellenizo, a verb that means to practice the Greek way of life or to call someone else to practice the Greek way of life. So what I'm saying again on this fourth objection is this. If Chrysostom's view is true, then we should have Greek-speaking Jews and Aramaic-speaking Jews here in the text or here as a translation. So we know we're talking about language. Greek-speaking Jews. I guess you could give us Grecian, but not from Hellenistai because it's not a linguistic term. It comes from a verb of action, of living, of doing something in your life. And on the flip side, we'd have to have, rather than Hebrew, something about Aramaic-speaking Jews. Now, at this point, I want to make a critical note regarding the NIV's translation of Acts 6:1. Here's what the NIV gives. It gives Grecian Jews. Interesting what they've done. They've made a mistake here. started on the right foot and ended on the wrong one. Grecian Jews and Aramaic-speaking community. Grecian Jews and Aramaic-speaking community. Now that first phrase would be okay. Notice all we have with the KJV is simply Grecians. And I don't know that, but maybe a lot of people, whenever they read a passage such as this in Acts, see simply, Greeks here. He's talking about Gentiles. So it's helpful maybe for the NIV to throw in Jews as a kind of a qualifier after that. Although that's what is in the term Grecian. It's not a Greek, or he would have said Greek. Grecian, you only find it these three times, Acts 6, 9, and 11, is showing us that we're not talking about Greeks or Gentiles. But that translation is okay, Grecian Jews. In other words, they start off in giving us Grecian Jews, they start off trying to get away from a strictly linguistic foundation to more of an ideological one. Grecian Jews. Not Jews born in Israel or born in Jerusalem, but Jews somehow influenced by the spirit of Hellenism. And that's proper. They're trying to get away from this strictly linguistic foundation. But then in the second part of their translation, Aramaic-speaking community, they fall right back into the language trap by giving us this translation, Aramaic-speaking community. That's simply a mistranslation. That is not what Luke is saying here. Now see, they may be a community and they may speak Aramaic, but that may just be another qualifier or characteristic of these people that's not found in the term itself. We'll give you a better and a different translation later. By the way, what you have in the KJV is perfectly fine. It's just that it probably needs a little more explanation. What you have in the NIV doesn't need any explanation. You know what that says, Grecian Jew. Well, I would imagine that's a Jew influenced by the Greeks. Aramaic-speaking community, all right, somehow they speak Aramaic, that's obvious, but somehow they must not have been influenced by the Greeks. So that makes sense to me. But you got an ideological translation on the one hand, Grecian Jews, and a linguistic one on the other hand, Aramaic-speaking community. And that shows inconsistency. So you may want to mark out that second rendition, Aramaic-speaking community, and just leave it blank until we come back and fill it in with something that would be better for the NIV. All right, there's the first view. Here's the second view. We are going quickly. I'm trying to go through them. I'm already finished with 1 week's worth of notes. I just didn't pause to give you all the other statistics and elaborate all of it. You say, oh, that's no wonder. That's why I'm confused tonight. Number two. Number two, we'll entitle the modern view. That's very similar to this first view, the traditional or the earliest one, the modern view. Most commentators and scholars of the last few centuries, including this one, have taken Chrysostom's view one step further. Remember, his is strictly a linguistic distinction. One group spoke Greek, the other group spoke a Semitic language. Most commentators and scholars recognize that's not enough. I mean, surely Luke means more than that. So they've taken it one step further. They say that the distinction is partly linguistic and partly geographic. Partly linguistic, partly geographic. So let me just give you kind of what a translation, according to this modern view, what a translation would be then of Grecians and Hebrews. It would read as follows: diaspora-born Greek-speaking Jews versus native-born Aramaic-speaking Jews. There you get the two languages in. Some spoke Greek, some spoke Aramaic, and two places of birth. Partly linguistic, partly geographic, diaspora-born versus native-born. Believe it or not, this is really going to tell you something about Acts that you probably didn't realize. I know you wouldn't realize without knowing why Luke he coins this new term, Hellenistai, and why he brings it into play right here in chapter 6, before he gets into this big discussion about Stephen and Philip. Two people who happen to have very Greek names, by the way. Those are not Hebrew names at all. So for Grecian, we'd have diaspora born. They're born perhaps in Greece, Italy, Babylon, Asia, Egypt. Diaspora born, Greek speaking, they spoke Greek and perhaps another language, versus the native born, the Israel born, Aramaic speaking Jews. This was the view of Erasmus, of Lightfoot. That's not Gordon. Say, that joke's old. Okay. Bengel, Bengel. Alford, Alford. We studied his translation. Alford. Devet. Studied him in OT Intro. And J.A.T. Robinson. We studied him in Christian Ethics with Situation Ethics. So we studied all of these names somewhere. You put all the classes together from Erasmus through Devet, that goes back to OT Intro, to J.A.T. Robinson, the English bishop, Anglican bishop, unregenerate Anglican bishop that taught Situation Ethics. Well, there's a little deviant of this view. I don't even guess I'll get into. Tries to make it. It's a claim that it's an. That last one, or the third one as well. Paul referring to himself as an Hebrew of Hebrews in Philippians 3, and yet we know he's a Greek-speaking, diaspora-born Jew. Now, we know he speaks Hebrew and Aramaic, and he was brought up in Israel also, but still, he was diaspora-born, Greek-speaking, and he never calls himself a Grecian. He's always calling himself an Hebrew or an Hebrew of Hebrews. All right, a third view. The proselyte view was held by Beza, B-E-Z-A, and in modern times by E.C. Blackman. By E.C. Blackman. I'll give you the reference where Blackman taught this. He taught it in an article entitled The Hellenists of Acts 6:1. That's an appropriate translation, the Hellenists instead of Grecians. That would be fine. The Hellenists of Acts 6:1. That was volume 48 of the Expository Times, 1937, pages 524, 525. Now, what Blackman has done is he's simply given us a revival of a 17th century view, and that was held by Beza. That was very popular then, the proselyte view. In other words, the Grecians are identified as the proselytes. So we've got a murmuring of the proselytes, those would be Gentiles who have been converted to Christianity, a murmuring of the proselytes against the Hebrews. But you see, all of the background study we've already done about proselytos and all of the other terms would simply disprove that. I mean, there's no case, unless this is the case, where Luke is going to use a term like Hellenistai, which is, purely a Hellenistic type term to speak of a group of proselytes. But Blackman has argued that very briefly in 2 pages in Expository Times, volume 48, 1937. And I think right here, probably in our passage, Acts 6, we'll have a statistic that will refute that. Verse 5, he calls Nicholas a proselyte. Well, now, why call Nicholas a proselyte here if, assuming these 7 men were appointed from this Grecian group in verse 1, why call Nicholas a proselyte if, in fact, anyone who came from that Grecian group was a proselyte? Why pick out one of them and call him the proselyte from Antioch? All of them would be proselytes. You already told us that with the word Grecian. if that's what Grecian means. And of course, as we've argued before, it simply can't mean that. So again, third view, the proselyte view, but the objection would be that Luke, in calling one of the 7 men appointed to help here in verse 5 a proselyte, assuming they were selected from this group, to represent it, implies that the rest were not proselytes. Now, they may be Greeks, they may be Jews influenced by Hellenism or something, but they simply can't be proselytes. By calling one of them a proselyte, you're implying the rest of them are not. The fourth view is the Essene view. E-S-S-E-N-E. That's one of the Jewish groups that we'll study later on. The Essenes, kind of like a monastic, ascetic, desert group of people who live near the Dead Sea, appropriately enough. Now, here's what we have with this view. This radical group of non-conforming Jews, the Essenes, were influenced by Hellenism. That's why they separated themselves from the regular mainstay of Judaism. And as we know from history, that's why the Essenes were noted for their extreme opposition to the temple, to all liturgy, and to the sacrificial way. The Essenes were very opposed to the temple at Jerusalem. Now, they're a group of Jewish people, but they are a radical nonconformist sect within Judaism. That these people say were influenced by Hellenism. We know this because they had an extreme opposition manifested against the temple, and we know that to be true because that's found in the Essene writings. You say, well, how does that tie into this? Well, remember that one, evidently from this group, Stephen, preaches a whole sermon which has more or less as kind of the concluding crux, the temple at Jerusalem. In verse 13 of chapter 6, this man ceaseth not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place. Acts 6:13. 2 charges are made against him, one concerning the temple, one concerning following the law. And then when you jump over into chapter 7, verse 48, isn't the polemic still one directed against the temple? The literal physical temple, and what it stood for. Howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Now we know the Essenes were radical in their opposition to the temple. So was Stephen. In other words, what you'd have to do is make Stephen a member of the Essene community. Or let's say a former member. Now he's converted to Christianity, but he's carried his Essene tendencies over with him into Christianity, and that's causing him to have a problem with Hebrew Jews like, Peter, James, and John, who are still going up to the temple to pray and to worship, the hours and times of prayer and worship. Concluding that passage, verse 49, Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things? So he makes a very stiff claim that God does not dwell in temples made by men, but his presence fills the universe. Amen. So doesn't this make sense to turn Stephen into a former member of the Essene community? Oscar Cullmann, a well-known German writer, many books by Cullmann, C-U-L-L-M-A-N. He is a liberal, though. Oscar Cullmann, in an article in 1955 in the Journal of Biblical Literature, abbreviated JBL, one of the theological journals you can subscribe to, but it's kind of, it is liberal. The Journal of Biblical Literature, JBL, an article 1955, Oscar Cullmann held to this view. As far as I know, maybe Cullmann invented the view. I don't know anyone else before Cullmann that would have thought that the Grecians here, listen to that the Grecians, that term, would have anything to do with the Essenes. They were a Jewish group, but their claim is, the reason Luke calls them Grecian is they were influenced by Hellenism. Well, that'd have to be to end up with a name like Grecian. Marcel Simon, S-I-M-O-N, espoused this view in a book written in 1958. And the only objection to this, and it may sound rather simplistic, but I think it is a valid objection, is that this Essene option is pure speculation. Coleman and Simon have nothing to say to prove their view. It's pure speculation. You've heard that sometimes when scholars don't have anything else to do, they make up things. That's literally true. That's literally true. I mean, why else would you... I mean, who even cares in the first place who the Grecians of Acts 6:1 are? Who even cares in the first place? And then in the second place, if you do care, then why or where in the world would you come up with a notion like these are the Essenes? These are former Essenes here. Well, there are some extenuating circumstances we don't need to get into why the liberals want to do that, because the liberals want to bring that Essene ascetic type community into the church and then somehow build on that to say that John was influenced by the Essenes, the Baptist, because we know that he went out in the desert, the wilderness, and spent his time there. And Jesus was influenced by the Essenes, and Paul, he went into the Arabian desert, remember? That's quite a bit north, but geography doesn't make any difference when it's pure speculation. Paul was influenced by it, and then in a roundabout way, that's why Paul is so opposed to women doing things, and why Paul is opposed to marriage, and why Paul is opposed to these things, his ascetic tendencies that he got from the Essene community. So they got something they want to prove. So they just invent something. You just invent the history. Like the Russians going back and rewriting history, you know. They just invent history to prove their theories. But it's pure speculation. It has nothing to do with Luke's purpose in Acts. He doesn't talk about the Essenes anywhere. The Essenes aren't mentioned in the New Testament. Fifth view. I'll even have less to say on this, that the Grecians are the Samaritans. Why not just say that they're the Chinese if we're going to just go down the list of the nations of the globe, you know? I mean, we know who the Samaritans are. They're over in chapter 8, verse 5. Philip went down and preached in a city of the Grecians. No, Samaria. You've got a term for that. If you want to talk about the Samaritans, you've got a term for it. Why hide it behind Grecian, this rare, coined, invented term of Luke's in Acts 6:1? This was the view of Abram Spiro, S-P-I-R-O. Abram Spiro. Just a nonsensical view. There's no support. It's pure speculation. The sixth view, spend a little more time on this, is the Greek view. This is another very popular theory like number 2. Number 2 and number 6 are some of the contenders for the throne here. Number 6, the Greek view. The claim here is that Hellenistai is merely a synonym for Hellene. In other words, the words we discussed earlier as number 5 and number 6 are synonyms. The Hellenists and any form of Greek or Gentile would simply be speaking of the same group. This was espoused by H.J. Cadbury in his multi-volume set entitled Beginnings of Christianity. People like Lake and Cadbury and who else? Harnack, Adolf Harnack. Those are the three that come to mind, are well-known church historians in the beginning of this century. Harnack and Lake and Cadbury, that of course wrote liberal treatises on the expanse of early Christianity. Notice the title of the book, Beginnings of Christianity. He espouses this view, let's see, in volume 3, page 106, and then in more detail in volume 5, pages 59 through 74. H.J. Cadbury. Well, let me give you a couple of my objections then to this Greek view. A couple of objections to the Greek view. Number 1, it's much too early in the Lucan narrative to have Gentiles entering the church. See, that's what they're saying, that Hellenist and Hellene are simply one and the same. That these are not Jews in any sense of the word, that they are Gentiles, Greeks. But it's too early, as we've seen in our earlier studies of the proselytes and the God-fearers, it's too early in the Lucan narrative to have Gentiles entering the church. Now, I can't go back and give you all the reasons why it's too early, but that has been covered on the earlier tapes. And of all places, this is particularly true in Jerusalem. To have a whole group of people. Now, there are occasions where proselytes have come into the faith, such as here in chapter 6 and verse 5. One is mentioned by name, and the proselytes from Rome in chapter 2 and verse 10. But to have a whole group of people that are, well, not really proselytes, and see, proselyte was a separate matter anyway. They came into Christianity through Judaism. But a whole group of people who are not proselytes, who have not had any contact with Judaism, who are pure Gentiles, and have come into the church this early in Luke's narrative, well, I think we've confused his whole objective in writing early church history then. And this is particularly true of Jerusalem. Cornelius would never have been given 2 complete chapters later on. And the Jerusalem church never would have initially responded so negatively as they do in chapter 11 if Gentiles had been in the church all along. Remember, you've got 2 whole chapters dealing with Cornelius because, here's a Gentile coming into the church with a lot of other Gentiles with him, and it causes big questions to be raised. Well, if you've already got a group in Jerusalem some years earlier in Acts 6:1 who are Gentiles and are part of the church, well, there'd never be a need for such negative reaction and discussion as we find in chapters 10 and 11. And even with Cornelius, we never see him entering the Jerusalem church. That's the fortress of Judaism there. He's way up in Caesarea somewhere by the Mediterranean. We don't even see Cornelius in the Jerusalem church, let alone a whole horde of people called Grecians, which really just means Gentiles or Greeks who have come into the faith apart from Judaism as early as Acts 6:1. Then a second objection to this Greek view. At the time of Acts 6 in the Jerusalem church, the only conceivable Gentile Christians would have to have been proselytes first. Now, see, whether or not Cornelius was a proselyte, see, that's a debated question. We've answered what we think is true, but that's a debated question. But that's found way over in chapter 10. To be this early, you would have to have been a proselyte first for a Gentile to be a Christian part of the early church, because the early church was a Jewish church. And we're talking about here in Jerusalem, not somewhere else. Now, they go up in chapter 8, but again, notice that's 2 chapters later, after where we're studying now, and they convert people in Samaria, but that's not Jerusalem. And people at Jerusalem evidently have a problem with that. That's why they have to send the apostles down for the prayer of the baptism of the Holy Spirit to make sure that everything's official there, because they're the ones that received it first. No pure or raw Gentiles were in the church at this time. Just think, if there had been non-proselyte Gentiles, they would never have been allowed to address the Sanhedrin as Stephen does in chapter 7. Now, we keep assuming, we've got an underlying assumption here, that the men of verse 5 are chosen to represent the Grecians, and the reason they're chosen is because they're chosen from that group. You chose some people from the group who could identify with it to represent the entire group. All right, let's make these Grecians, according to this 6th view here, let's make them pure Gentiles. They're not proselytes or anything of the order. We've got one of them who has been invited in to address the Jewish Sanhedrin. Why, they would have thrown the man out and stoned him to come into the sacred tribunal of the Jewish people. Stephen is not even a proselyte here. Remember, we've got our proselyte. Nicholas is the proselyte. And I rather doubt Nicholas would ever have been allowed in before the Sanhedrin. Stephen must be a Jew. A true Jew. A Jew by blood. So I think both of these objections, maybe in particular this last one, and maybe more specifically the last point I made about it concerning Stephen's address of the Sanhedrin, proves this view simply to be false. And I think it would also prove, in turn, that whatever we end up saying about the Grecians, they must be Jews. Stephen is one of them. He addresses the Sanhedrin, 60 verses of Acts 7, the longest chapter in the book, 60 verses. Whatever we want to do or say about the Grecians, we're going to have to start with square one, that they're Jewish people. They're not Gentiles. They are Jewish people. You simply could not have wholesale Gentiles in the church this early. Okay, a seventh view. I'm getting close to doing 2 weeks' worth of notes tonight. I told you I could. This is Moule's view. M-O-U-L-E-S. Again, we have to go back to the expository times. We did this for the third view, the proselyte view, with E.C. Blackman. Blackman's not well known. C.F.D. Moule is well known. He's written commentaries on Colossians and things like that. C.F.D. Moule. Moule in the expository times, which is always abbreviated, E-X-P and capital T, expository times. Volume 70, the year was 1959, pages 100 through 102. And I like the title of Moule's article. It was entitled, Once More, Who Were the Hellenists? In other words, this view is going to finally be the official view of who were the Hellenists. See how many people have written on this matter? Because the scholars have read enough of Acts to know that it's crucial to understanding Acts, who you make these people to be here. See, what I've said already, although I think it's kind of basic knowledge to you now that I've labored so much in your ears about proselytes and God-fearers, would be news to a lot of people who just, read their Bible, that these Grecians are not Greeks or Gentiles. You would think in the term you're talking about Gentiles that it was some conflict between Gentiles and Jews in the early church. That's the obvious surface reading. There's a conflict between Gentiles and Jews, but that is hardly true. So Moule's view, once more, who were the Hellenists? Expository Times, 70, 1959, pages 100 to 102. The Grecians, he said, spoke only Greek, and the Hebrews spoke Greek plus Aramaic. Now, you see, he's seen one of the earlier problems I raised back with that first view, that if both groups spoke one and only one language, how could they even understand each other? How could you even have a murmuring arise? So you've got to have at least one of the groups, preferably two of them, preferably both, but at least one of the groups speaking not only its own language, but the language of the other people. So that, let's say, Group B can understand what Group A has to say, although Group A, the reverse is not true, cannot understand B. So the Grecians spoke Greek, and they're Jewish people, and the Hebrews spoke Greek plus Aramaic. Well, that may well be true. It solves some of the problems. It may even solve the problem why Paul could call himself an Hebrew. If we get the Hebrew speaking something in addition to a Semitic tongue. We know Paul, born in a foreign land, had to speak Greek. We know he spoke Greek from Acts 21. We're told that. We saw that last week. But still, notice that all Moule has done is he's given us a linguistic argument again. And we started off from the very beginning saying that language is not enough, because that's not the origin of this term, Hellenistai. Language is not enough. And all that is a language argument. Now, what I'd like to do next, after that seventh view, is to show you how far we've come. So this is kind of summarizing what we've said thus far in preparation for looking at what I think is the correct view that we'll start on next time. So here's what we've done thus far. Let's summarize it so that we've got everything clearly in our minds, or at least in our notes. And I have it listed under 5 points here. Number 1, that just says what I've been saying all along tonight anyway. Language distinction is not enough because, and I'll give you 2 becauses. Language distinction is not enough. Surely there is a language distinction, but what I'm saying is it's not enough. Because, A, Paul was an Hebrew of Hebrews, but he spoke Greek. He calls himself an Hebrew of Hebrews, but he spoke Greek. The only distinction is one of language, then we've got a contradiction on our hands there. Language distinction is not enough because A, Paul was an Hebrew of Hebrews, but he spoke Greek. B, because the term Hebrew, as it's used in Acts 6:1, is always ethnic in meaning and not linguistic. Now, let me just pause to clarify something here, a thought from the past that's floating around in your mind. As I think I've shown you a long time ago, the King James gives us Hebrew a lot in the New Testament when what we really should have is Aramaic. The only time that we have Hebrew, when we mean Hebrew, is the book of Revelation. And John uses it there, and he uses a different form of it. But then, the reason we know it's language is he'll say something like, this means such and such in the Hebrew language, or in the Hebrew tongue. When you just call a group of people the Hebrews, see, we're talking about something different than language. If you call them the Hebrew-speaking people, okay. That'd be an unusual way of saying it, but okay. However, that's not the case here. The case we have before us in Acts 6:1 is an ethnic case. It's not like the other places in Revelation, the book of Revelation, where Hebrew does mean the Hebrew language. Here it does not mean that. Here it means the Hebrew people. Surely they spoke a Semitic tongue, probably Aramaic, but he's saying something else about them in addition to that. Number 2, geographic distinction is not enough. Geographic distinction is not enough. Now, it may be included. I'm getting ahead of myself to keep saying it may be. Language may be. Geography may be thought of here. But it's not enough left on its own or left in the company with a language distinction. Because what about the following possibilities? All right, now I'm going to give you 4. I know this is a little confusing tonight, but don't worry about it. Because what about the following possibilities? A, here's one possibility that show to me that geographic distinction is not enough. Following possibilities. A, what about native-born Aramaic-speaking Jews who also spoke Greek? Well, what would you call them then? See, they're native-born, they're Aramaic-speaking Jews. You'd think of them as Hebrews, but yet they spoke Greek, so then you'd also want to somehow throw them out into the diaspora. In which group would Luke intend for us to place them if we had people like this? And surely we have. B, another possibility. What about the possibility of diaspora-born Greek-speaking Jews who also spoke Aramaic? Now, that's not been discussed in one of the options so far with the Grecians. We've got the Hebrew-speaking 2 languages, but not the Grecians. Diaspora-born Greek-speaking Jews who also spoke Aramaic. Where would Luke intend for us to put this group of people? Doesn't Paul fit that second group there? Diaspora-born Greek-speaking Jew who also spoke Aramaic. Paul fits that group there. So what are we going to call him? He calls himself an Hebrew of Hebrews. If we're basing everything on geography, I think we'd call him a Grecian because he was born in the diaspora. C, a third possibility. What about native-born, that is born in Israel? I'm getting all the possibilities that if you got this gene from this parent and this gene from the other, then it means this for you. Native-born Greek-speaking. They say, now how could this possibly be true? Well, here's my imagined scenario. Let's assume that the parents may have recently moved to Palestine. They would obviously speak Greek, and obviously the parents would speak Aramaic too, or they'd never move to Palestine. They'd never get by, or they'd have to carry a little Aramaic pocket dictionary around with them, like you do if you go to Germany or something like that. Sauerkraut. I think I got it right from the dictionary here. So what about their parents have recently moved to Palestine and they chose to teach their children, for some reason, Greek. So the children are born in Palestine, they're native born, but they're Greek speaking. Now where do we put these people? Maybe I've gone to extremes in disproving some of these theories here, but anyway. We'd think we'd call them, well, Grecians because they're Greek speaking, but Hebrews because they're native born. D, what about diaspora-born Aramaic-speaking Jews? And you can work, it out yourself, perhaps close enough to Palestine, such as Syria. So they're diaspora-born, but they speak Aramaic because that's what you spoke in Syria. A third point, the Grecians, they cannot be Gentiles because this would destroy the entire scope of Acts. They cannot be Gentiles. Number 4, they could not be proselytes because, assuming the 7 selected came from the Grecian group, it would be superfluous for Luke to specify one in verse 5 as a proselyte. Language distinction is not enough. Geographic distinction is not enough. They can't be Gentiles. Number 4, they can't be proselytes because of Acts 6:5. And number 5, and I'm going to conclude with this tonight, it's an obvious fact, but it's often overlooked in this study, that both groups are Jewish, with a few proselyte exceptions, such as Nicholas, among the Grecians. If there are proselytes, they would be small in number. We'd count their lot cast with the Grecians. And so truly these would be Grecians, Greeks, Gentiles, not Jews. But for the most part, both groups, the Grecians and the Hebrews, are strictly Jewish people. It's just too early in Luke's narrative to bring Gentiles into it. We've got a problem in the early church, a problem between two different groups, very distinct groups. And the problem is not due to language, it's not due to where they were born, these things only. It's due to something else. Now those may have influenced it, or those may be signs of what the distinction is all about, but it is simply not going far enough.